Hi everyone, my name is Stanley and today I'm going to give you a broad overview of international airport planning practices. By way of introduction about myself, I have a bachelor's degree in urban regional planning and I'm now working as an airport planner at a consultancy here in Brisbane, and in addition to that I'm doing some research at Queensland University of Technology. So my research and work experience varies from international scale to smaller regional airports, particularly within Australia, and today I thought I'd try and cover all bases, starting with a global perspective and then distilling down into airport management and operations within smaller airports around Australia. So just quickly, this is what I'll be talking about for this lecture today. I'll start with the historical evolution of airport planning to provide a bit of a context, and then looking at the changing role of airports within this evolution. I'll talk about why this matters, why does it matter to us. I'll give an academic context overview and the industry, and then provide some case studies, international case studies, a little bit on regional airports, some of the complexities faced across airport planning around the world, and then I'll summarise for you. So firstly, when we look at the history of airport planning, it really started in 1910 with the Paris International Air Navigation Conference. And then the First World War really saw the first use of aircraft for military purposes. And then in 1919 we had the Paris Peace Conference. Countries from around the world attended that conference. 1939 to 45, obviously the Second World War, there was a huge uptake in aircraft for military purposes during the war. And then in 1944 there was a convention on international civil aviation, which soon then formed into the International Civil Aviation Organisation, which is ICAO, which is still one of the dominant international organisations today. So most significantly in this evolution, in 1987, ICAO produced an airport planning manual in 1967, which was later then revised in 1987. Late in the 20th century, we saw a lot of airport privatisation and commercialisation practices increasingly adopted across the world, Australia being one of the first countries to take up this model, and then we saw countries, Canada adopting similar, not the same, but similar model, and then Britain also adopting the privatisation model. I just want to point out quickly that I'm only covering Western democratic airport planning context. There will be obviously different cultural and political contexts in Asia and other areas of the world that will have entirely different planning and management experiences. But unfortunately, I do not have time today to cover all of those. But I think it's important to note that I'm really only looking at Western democratic countries. So what do I mean when I say that the airport's role have changed? Well, as I've just presented, the origins of airports are really strategic military bases within the cities. And that is the reason why they're often located out of the cities. And now we have a rapid increase in air passenger transport, which has totally transformed the role of airports across the world and the operations and the way in which they operate within their cities or their towns. We've seen an evident increase in privatisation and commercialisation, not only the airport ownership itself, but also the strategies around land use development and route development at airports. Airports have evolved into major hubs within the cities, often multinodal transport hubs and logistics hubs. And the social licence to operate for airports has become increasingly pertinent across both regional and large capital city airports. And by social licence to operate, I mean airports are increasingly susceptible to stakeholder wants and needs. And if the airport does not have this social licence to operate granted to them by the community, then that can have some serious economic and social impacts for the airport. So why does it matter? Why do we care about airport planning? Well, when you take a minute to consider how many people use airports across the world and how many planes are flying at one moment in time, it becomes quite evident. So last year there was around 3.5 billion people carried in passenger aircraft across the globe, expected to increase to about 3.8 billion by the end of this year. There's around 50 million tonnes of cargo throughput a year globally, and airports and aviation contribute about $2.2 trillion to the global economy annually. And if you have a quick look at flightradar.com, you can see that there's thousands of aircraft flying around at any moment, about 5,000 or 6,000, which when you think about how many millions of people and they all have to land somewhere. So there is a need to plan for these airports, and as these numbers increase, we really need to be aware of and future-proofing for airport planning. So in addition to their significant economic impacts, airports also have environmental and social impacts. So evidently, with more aircraft in the sky, we have more environmental impacts. Aircraft noise has land use planning impacts, but it also has potential health impacts. There will be more aviation emissions, and there will be more potential runoff, such as PFOS fuel from firefighting equipment. In addition, airports are crucial as a social piece of infrastructure, especially for smaller towns, but also for the community in a city and state and regional scale. They're essential to provide access to cities and towns, either for emergency services, postal services, or providing international business opportunities. Increasingly, they're being seen as a community asset, particularly smaller airports. They're taking sort of ownership and pride in their airports, and airport planners need to be aware of this going forward. So just to give a broad overview of the academic research that I've identified with a particular regard to airport planning, the research is extremely broad and can encompass things such as airside, airspace modelling and scientific environmental modelling, but just for this overview, I'm looking at airport planning and management. So there are three key themes which I identified, which are governance and commercialisation, planning processes, and stakeholder engagement. So commercialisation and governance is inherently linked with airport planning. It defines regulation and expectations within the process. And within the literature, there's four key areas which have been focused on to date. So there is a few global studies, although not many. There's a focus on the South Pacific, Eastern Asia, and Western Europe. The literature primarily focuses on non-aeronautical commercial development within the airport site. So looking at price regulations or lack of price regulations within privatised models, questioning the need for regulating privately owned airports, looking at the efficiency of privatised airports, and the integration of transport infrastructure within the broader community. Australia is particularly mentioned in this literature and noted for its light-handed regulation after privatisation in the 1990s. So this leads me to the second key theme that I've identified within the literature, which is the planning process. So as I previously mentioned, governance has an impact on the planning process, and it's particularly recognised to have a complex and uncertain circumstances for airport planning, depending on the model of commercialisation or privatisation. Master planning in particular as a mechanism has received some investigation, and there are three issues that were consistently identified within this body of literature, which is the land use conflict with adjacent lands, infrastructure provision to the airport site or around the airport site, and community consideration and engagement within the master planning process. So stakeholder engagement is the third key area of literature which I identified. Often airports are criticised for not engaging sufficiently with their stakeholders, or particularly with the community, and this is more evident within privatised airport research, although there hasn't been much research conducted on publicly owned airports and their community engagement. So the main issues that are brought up with regards to stakeholder engagement are noise levels, air quality, traffic congestion, and the scale and the nature of commercial development at airports. So there are three, key gaps that I've identified within this literature. There's little investigation on international airport planning contexts. There are some within specific regions, but there's not really a review of an overall international comparison and whether or not this governance structures in each have an impact on the planning process. The airport planning process from inception to operationalisation lacks review, and master planning, particularly as a mechanism for airport planning, really lacks a review when you're considering from start plan making all the way through to implementation and operationalisation. The literature that I found really focuses on one particular stage within there, one or two. There's also a marked lack of information regarding the strategies undertaken by airports for stakeholder engagement, particularly when you're considering all relevant external stakeholders. There is a big focus on the community, but there seems to be a lack of literature that looks at the government stakeholders, the industry stakeholders, and all other, and there is a huge amount of external stakeholders to airport planning. So just to provide a quick industry context from my work as an airport planner, as I previously mentioned, a lot of my work has to do with regional airports across Australia. And I see significant disparities between the way capital city airports are planned as opposed to regional airports. This is, I think, largely to do with the support given to regional airports. Only recently in Australia we had a master planning guideline produced, which was in 2013 by the Australian Airports Association. Before that, the airports or the local governments were sort of left to themselves to plan for their airports. And when you compare that to the strict structure that the capital city airports have to rely on, there's a huge disparity. Also within industry, there's a lot of a shift towards diversification of revenue streams. So airports are relying less and less on landing fees and passenger taxes, and they're looking more to develop their land for non-aviation, which is when we end up seeing shopping centres at airports, and also just focusing on things outside of route development or aviation as such, so focusing on regional growth and focusing on the ownership and governance model options that regional airports may have. Regional airports I'm finding are really wanting to grow as hubs within their region, especially in Australia when everything is so dispersed, everything is so far away. There is really a proactive shift from state and local governments to sort of be the hub for their regions. So regional airports are generally owned by local government councils in Australia. Some states across Australia are currently undergoing reviews of whether or not this is the best ownership and governance structure for the airports, whether the council is best placed to operate these airports and manage these airports. There are various models being investigated within these processes, ranging from privatisation of individual airports, privatisation of an agglomeration, a group of airports, corporatisation of just the operating and management of the airports, but keeping the ownership, per se, with the local government council, and then things such as public-private partnership organisations. In addition, I'm noticing there's an increased expectation from the community. This is not only the case with regional airports, but also capital city airports. There's an increased expectation of transparency, but also about engagement. So people are becoming more and more empowered, and with the rise of social media and technology and how easy it is for the local community to contact their airport or to have their voice heard, I've definitely seen an increase in that over the last couple of years. So just quickly, this is sort of how I view the airport governance, or the airport context. So we have the governance context, the airport planning process, and the stakeholder engagement strategies. They all fit within the airport's operations. And then you have all that fitting within the municipal or local government context, which also fits within the state and national context. And then you have these relationships between the airport operations and the municipal level, and the airport operations and the state or national level. Across all of these, stakeholder engagement is an issue, or is an element of airport planning, which is crucial and increasingly more and more important. So I thought I'd provide an example of some case studies of different governance structures which have varying challenges. Some of them are similar and some of them are contrasting, and they're reasonably similar airports on the face of it. So there's Brisbane, Dusseldorf in Germany, and Vancouver in Canada. Each of these airports have different ownership structures, ranging from 100% private to 50-50, and then 100% public, or Vancouver is a not-for-profit organisation. They each have similar passenger movements. They're all within about 4 million passengers of each other at the moment, and they each have similar aircraft movements. So just taking Brisbane to start with. Brisbane is obviously the capital city of Queensland in Australia. The airport is under a 50-year lease with a 49-year renewal option, and is wholly privatised, listed with shareholders to the Brisbane Airport, non-listed, sorry, to Brisbane Airport Corporation. They produce a master plan every 5 years as required by the Airports Act, which is the federal legislation that regulates them. So Brisbane is an interesting case study. They've changed a lot their relationship with their external stakeholders and planning processes since they were privatised. They historically had a lot of conflict with state and local governments. They in fact went to court against each other about a retail development on the airport site. Noise is an ongoing issue for Brisbane, but lucky for them, they're on the bay, so a lot of their flights go out over the water. But they have been known historically to not have a good relationship with their community when it comes to noise, although this has been improving, particularly recently as they're looking to build a new runway, which will open in 2020, and they've conducted extensive engagement around this project. The change in leadership which occurred at the airport within the last 6 years has significantly impacted the way the airport plans and the way they're perceived by their external stakeholders for the better. And the ownership structure in particular is identified to have both positive and negative impacts, depending on who you talk to. Düsseldorf Airport is the capital city of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. It's a public-private partnership, so it's got 50% is the city of Düsseldorf and 50% is 3 major shareholders. It is also, all these 3 case studies are signatories to the ICAO convention, which I touched on earlier, but the way they interpret these convention guidelines is significantly different across all 3 airports. So Düsseldorf produces master plans as required by ICAO, but theirs are not publicly available. So the planning process is really not very transparent at Düsseldorf Airport, and they have significant conflict over noise, particularly with it's surrounded by residential development. This has been a historic issue and it's continuing at the moment. They're looking at increasing their movements and they're having significant backlash for that. So there's a number of municipalities, there's actually a few local governments that border the airport site, not just the one like Brisbane and Vancouver, and that results in a lot of complex stakeholder relationships and networks. The 50% public ownership of the airport, interestingly, does not appear to affect the airport planning process at all. No one actually that I've spoken to has identified that to be an issue or a positive benefit to the airport. I was just looking at Vancouver Airport lastly. It's a major airport in British Columbia in Canada. It's operated by the Vancouver Airport Authority, which is a not-for-profit organisation. It's a government entity. They're also on a long-term lease, and the land is still owned by Transport Canada. So it's similar to Brisbane in that it's on a long-term lease on federal land, regulated federally only, but it's a not-for-profit structure, so it doesn't have any shareholders like Brisbane does. And they're required to produce a master plan every 5 years with a 20-year forecast as well. That is released publicly, much like Brisbane. So I found in Vancouver the leadership, again, like Brisbane, makes a huge impact. They've had a recent change in leadership, and everyone I spoke to said that it has a positive impact on how the airport integrates within its city. The airport, interestingly, has managed projects around the airport site outside of its jurisdiction, so they work quite well with the local governments around them. They have minimum issues with their stakeholders, and actually their ownership structure is identified as a key to the success. So there's not much conflict with their stakeholders, and a lot of people identified that down to being a result of the fact that they don't have shareholders and they're not a profit-driven airport per se. 100% of their profits have to go back into the airport. They've obviously learned some lessons from the past, like most airports. So there was a bit of controversy when they were building another runway a decade ago or so, and they've learned lessons and they put in structures in place to mitigate any future conflict over those sorts of projects. So just briefly on regional airports, those were 3 large, significant, about 20 million year passenger airports. And now this sort of summary, this is across Australian regional airports, so they range from a few thousand to a few 100,000 passengers a year. As I said before, they're largely owned by local governments, and this has resulted in a few challenges for regional airport planning. For one, there's limited funding for infrastructure upgrades. There's political influences within local government, which impacts the airport a lot more significantly than if it was a separate entity. The airport revenue is sometimes not directly put back into the airport, it's put into the local government basket, and then it's not necessarily used for the airport, which causes some issues. There's also, I've seen sometimes a misuse of rates and taxes from the residents, where the council has ambition for their airport and invests a lot of money, and it's actually taxpayers' money. So across Australia, there's about 2,000 airports and airfields. There are about 317 which are registered as having significant regular passenger movements. And the Australian Airports Association recently published something which said there are about 50% of these are operating at a loss. It's not all doom and gloom though. A lot of the airports a lot of the communities have great pride around their airports, and they definitely see it as key to their community. And also, as I mentioned before, the local governments are really starting to look at how they can improve their practices and whether or not a different ownership structure is maybe the best option for them. So as you can see, there is a number of complexities when you're looking at airport planning across the world. Governance structures vary from country to country, but they also vary within the same country or within the same state. Between large and small airports, there is a significant dichotomy between the governance and planning processes, and this impacts how airports are managed and operate and integrate within their city. Airports really do operate in a highly public and political paradigm, and they're nationally significant pieces of infrastructure, but they're largely driven by revenue. These capital city airports are largely driven by revenue to support their operations. So there's a bit of a conflict between their social role and their shareholders. The political landscape can influence the planning process. I'm only to democratic context here. I believe in an autocratic government, it would likely have a significantly more of an effect than it does here. And also, importantly, airports have a diverse and complex stakeholder network, and pleasing everyone is really a challenge. So my key take home would have to be one size does not fit all. I see different planning and management experiences across similarly sized airports within the same regulatory environment, and every airport has to be managed and planned for on a case-by-case basis. In my opinion, the airport literature currently does not effectively address all the complexities of airport planning. Obviously, it's a significant ask because it's a huge body of research if you were to do it, but it does need to be, I believe it needs to be looked at a little bit more, and also the research needs to address things that are actually applicable to industry. Lessons can certainly be learned from international comparisons, both at large and small airports. Airports shouldn't be operating within a bubble. They can learn from each other quite a lot, actually, I believe, especially when attending conferences internationally, and you can see what you can benefit a lot from engaging with other airports. There needs to be further investigation of the impact of all ownership and governance models, not just privatisation, which is currently the case, from my understanding. There needs to be investigation on private partnerships, corporatisation, not-for-profit organisations, because you can't just copy and paste these across all airports. There really needs to be a case-by-case study done. Airports really need to embrace technology going forward. After attending a few conferences, I've noticed that there's significant amounts of technology that airports can start using, such as applications for their terminal, solar power, renewable energy, social media, all kinds of technology. I think that the airport would get cost efficiencies and increase their social licence to operate. Aviation is likely to only increase in the future, and airport professionals, I believe, need to be proactive in future-proofing for their airport going forward. That's it. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me on either of those emails.